My name is Bea Friedlander, and I am the board president of Attorneys for Animals. And we're calling this a belated Be Kind to Animals presentation. We apologize for the issues a couple of weeks ago, but they've been fixed. We're really happy today to have Brittany Peet, attorney, who is the Deputy General Counsel for the Captive Animal Law Enforcement for PETA Foundation. She works on behalf of animals who are held captive in roadside zoos, traveling shows, and the film and television industries through legal and regulatory actions and public advocacy programs or campaigns. She also negotiates and coordinates wild and exotic animal rescues for PETA and has overseen the rescues of more than 400 chinchillas, 73 bears, 75 big cats, 13 chimpanzees, and 2 baboons. Pete appeared in the Netflix documentary Tiger King and was part of the PETA team that achieved the first legal precedent, finding that using big cat cubs in public encounters violates the Federal Endangered Species Act. Brittany is a graduate of Michigan State University College of Law, and we're so pleased to welcome her today. Toward the end, we'll have some time for questions, so please put them in the chat. I'm going to turn it over to you, Brittany. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Bea. I appreciate it, and thanks everyone for coming. Okay, now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I'm pretty sure I know how to do this. Here we go. Go back to the beginning. There we go. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. As Bea said, I'm Deputy General Counsel for Captive Animal Law Enforcement with the PETA Foundation. The Captive Animal Law Enforcement Division, we call CALE for short. And in CALE, we advocate for animals who are used in entertainment with a particular focus on animals who are held captive in roadside zoos. And it's really great to be presenting at this event for Attorneys for Animals. I grew up in mid-Michigan. I went to college at MSU and then law school at MSU College of Law. I left and moved to Washington, D.C. to work with the PETA Foundation right after law school. And I'd been there for almost 12 years when the pandemic hit. And suddenly we were working remotely. So I've been back in mid-Michigan since September. And I recently started looking for a house in Lansing, which, as everyone knows, is going to be a long process given the current housing market. But it's great to be here with hopefully a crowd of at least some Michigan lawyers. I want to introduce you to someone right on cue, Leonard. This is the dog that you will undoubtedly hear throughout this presentation. There he is again. He went for a long swim earlier today, and I thought that he would be tired for this meeting, but he seems to have woken up just in time. So sorry about that. Hopefully it's not too disruptive, but that's Leonard. He's a rescue dog. PETA rescued him a couple years ago, and he's very sweet, but also quite talkative. So first question, what is a roadside zoo? The way that we describe it at PETA or the PETA Foundation is just generally, it's a captive animal facility that is not accredited by either the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is the gold standard accrediting body for zoos. The Detroit Zoo, for example, is an AZA accredited zoo, or the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, which is the gold standard for sanctuary accreditation. I think the closest GFAS accredited sanctuary to us in Michigan is the Black Pine Animal Sanctuary in Indiana. We don't have any GFAS accredited wildlife sanctuaries in Michigan, but there may be some farmed animal sanctuaries in Michigan that are GFAS accredited, I'm not sure. So roadside zoos, because of chronic under-enforcement of exotic animal laws across the board, it's led to unfettered trade in wildlife and the proliferation of the roadside zoo industry. And roadside zoos' biggest sources of revenue are typically wildlife sales and animal encounters. And big cat and bear cub petting are especially lucrative for roadside zoos. And PETA focuses a lot of attention on the issue of cub petting, which is when baby animals, usually big cats and bear cubs, are taken from their mothers to be used for photo ops or direct contact encounters with the public. And as this graphic demonstrates, PETA focuses on cub petting because of the level of cruelty that it causes at all life stages for the victims. From the moment that the cubs are taken from their mothers, then exploited in petting, then killed or discarded to cramped roadside zoo cages, or sold to private owners or used as breeding machines themselves. One of the primary animal welfare issues inherent in cub petting are the serious health risks that cubs face. And those include, as we already discussed, the stress of maternal separation. And there's also stress inherent in that public handling, as well as the quashed genetic expectations. So for example, bear and tiger cubs expect for that first period of their lives to be with their mothers and their siblings and no one else. And so when they're passed around from person to person at cub petting events, or even just raised by humans, it quashes those genetic expectations and causes stress. These animals also have underdeveloped immune systems, so they're not able to fight off infection as well as older animals might be able to. The really young cubs aren't even able to regulate their own temperatures. So if they're brought to a county fair in the summer, they could easily overheat and die from heat stress. These cubs also often suffer from poor nutrition, which can result in a disease called metabolic bone disease, which we'll see an example of in a few minutes. And one of the big misconceptions that we hear a lot from people who attend these encounters is, oh, I saw these cubs who were being used for petting and they'd clearly been drugged. That does happen occasionally, but it's actually really rare. What happens more often is, just like your kittens at home, big cat cubs who are used for petting should be sleeping for around 20 hours a day. But when they're forced to work for 8 to 10 hours a day, which is the reality for most cats who are used in cub petting, they're really just exhausted. And so we've seen instances where cubs who are used for petting are so exhausted that they have to literally be dragged in to the cub petting area by their tails or by their paws because they can't even stand upright anymore. So here's an example of what I was talking about with metabolic bone disease. So the cub who's coming into the frame right now, her name is Nala, and she was rescued from a big cat cub petting operation. A man named Jeff Lowe, who you may know if you have seen Tiger King. And Jeff Lowe in particular has been notorious for inadequate nutrition of big cat cubs. And basically what happens with metabolic bone disease is the bones become extremely weak and subject to fracture. So what happened with Nala, that video was taken on the day that we rescued her from Jeff Lowe's facility. She'd just been unloaded from her rescue crate or from her transport crate when that video was taken. And this was how she presented when when she was rescued as well. She could only take a few steps in any direction before falling over. The sanctuary that she was transferred to is in Colorado. They quickly transported her to Colorado State University's veterinary school, and they found that she had suffered multiple fractures. And this is a cat who's only around 6 to 9 months old. And she'd already suffered multiple fractures in her legs. And they also found that she was suffering from severe nutritional deficiencies. So all of these stresses combine to tax an already overtaxed and underdeveloped immune system. And that leads to the extremely high mortality rate for cubs who are used, particularly in the big cat cub petting industry. Another reason that PETA focuses so much on cub petting is because it's created a massive big cat overpopulation crisis, and that has led to suffering on a mass scale. And while we don't know the true number of big cats in the United States because of a lack of regulation and tracking, it's believed at least that there are far more tigers in captivity in the United States than the 3,900 that are left in the wild. And because there are so many tigers in zoos and traveling shows and backyards as pets, it creates the public misimpression that tigers aren't actually endangered. And that endangers conservation efforts and funding for wild tigers. Cub petting also enriches the worst of the worst exhibitors and breeders. Most roadside zoos are located in rural, remote areas without much access to tourism, and they usually charge pretty low admission fees because it's all they can get. And they operate on shoestring budgets, but cub petting can bring in hundreds of thousands. We've even seen facilities bringing in more than $1 million a year based on cub petting alone. But the cubs can only be used for cub petting for a few months, while big cats can live to be 20 years or older. So if a facility also breeds cubs and sells them to others in the industry, they can get between $2,000 and $10,000 each. So that's $2,000 to $10,000 every few months. And some of these facilities are operating with multiple cubs at a time. So you can easily see how you can get to those huge numbers. And facilities usually charge between $25 and $200 for cub encounters. One facility that operates in Miami was using a baby chimpanzee for encounters up until a few months ago. And they were charging, I think it was $400 for just 2 minutes with the chimpanzee. So you really get into astronomical numbers. But what we see is that the profit never goes back into animal care, because the facilities that understand animals and prioritize welfare would never prematurely separate a cub from their mother unless it was necessary for medical reasons. And if they had to, they would never use that prematurely separated cub in encounters with the public for all the reasons that we've already talked about. So what happens after cub petting? As I mentioned, the cubs can live, or the cats can live for 20 years or more. And once they've outlived their profitability, it's all about the bottom line for these exhibitors. So some are put on display at other roadside zoos. Some are sold to private owners, like the cat, which is likely what happened with the cat who was recently seen in that person's front yard in Houston, Texas. Others are used for breeding and to continue the cycle of cruelty, and some are killed. Joe Exotic, who I got to know a little bit, told me the first time that I met him that some of the people that he sold big cat cubs to killed the cats when they had grown out of cub petting by hitting them in the head with a hammer, and that another one of these guys called Doc Antle, who operates in South Carolina, had a gas chamber on his property, and that he would put the cubs in a gas chamber, kill them that way, and that he also had a crematorium. And so it's as if these cubs never existed. And because of lax enforcement, they almost always get away with it. So how do animal lawyers address welfare issues for captive wildlife? In CALE, we take the kitchen sink approach. We find and we use every potential legal angle that we can to weaken these exhibitors, get help for the animals, end the worst abuses for captive wildlife, and to close the worst abusers. There are two, primary federal laws that we use to target captive wildlife specifically. The one that we use most commonly is called the Animal Welfare Act. It's the federal law that is designed by mandate of Congress to ensure the humane treatment of animals who are used for entertainment. There are a lot of exceptions to the Animal Welfare Act. It only applies to mammals, so cold-blooded animals are not covered. They're also currently not regulating birds, which is another issue. But the mandate versus the reality. The reality is the USDA treats exhibitors as their customers rather than working to ensure the humane treatment of animals. There is a chronic lack of enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act's already weak and vague regulations. And that is exacerbated by the fact that the USDA is understaffed at all levels, and there's no citizen supervision. So there's no way for advocates or members of the public to directly sue on behalf of animals or against abusers under the Animal Welfare Act. Only the USDA has jurisdiction to enforce the Animal Welfare Act, and they mostly don't. And they're mostly able to get away with it because of deference to agency discretion under the Administrative Procedures Act. So this one is really frustrating. We try to find any opportunity that we can to advocate on behalf of animals under the Animal Welfare Act. We push the agency, we still submit complaints. And importantly, we'll talk about this in the context of litigation as well. We also arm ourselves with experts, with welfare experts, husbandry experts, behavior experts, veterinary experts, because we don't want, it undermines our credibility if it's me making the welfare assessments of captive wildlife. I'm a lawyer, I'm not an expert. So in CALE, we have 2 wildlife veterinarians on staff, as well as now we have 4 wildlife biologists as well, all of whom have significant experience with captive wildlife themselves. So we have our own in-house experts who can do these assessments for us. But in certain circumstances, we also consult with outside experts, one of whom is on the call today, Jay Pratt. And that lends credibility, additional credibility to our assertions. One of the most recent examples of harnessing what's going on in helping to improve protections for animals was COVID-19. We started to hear that captive tigers were highly susceptible to COVID-19. We were starting to see infections. And so as soon as we started seeing that, we drafted what's called an emergency petition for rulemaking, calling on the USDA to immediately ban cub petting because of big cats' susceptibility to COVID-19. Because of what we already talked about, big cat cubs don't have fully developed immune systems yet. All this other stress that they suffer further taxes their immune systems. And they're much more likely to be exposed to COVID-19 because of all of the public contact that they're exposed to. So it seemed like a no-brainer, right? Unfortunately, the USDA disappointed even in this circumstance. They did act, but what they did was issue a set of guidelines to exhibitors. Well, like I said before, the exhibitors who care about animal welfare already aren't doing cub petting. So as you can expect, unfortunately, the guidelines that were supposed to help protect big cat cubs from COVID-19 were completely ignored by the exhibitors that engage in cub petting. So the next federal law that we use to advocate on behalf of captive wildlife is the Endangered Species Act, and that's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And like the Animal Welfare Act, it also has very vague regulations. So this is the one that we use most often. It's called the take provision. And this is the definition of take: to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect. And so some of these terms are obvious, right? So we know what it means to kill. But the definitions of harm and harassment, which I won't parse with you because it would take too long, are really complicated and really vague. And so we've had to litigate to try to get to their meaning. And the reason that we were able to do that is because the ESA does have a citizen suit provision. And so that's why the Endangered Species Act has been the primary method that we've used to advocate on behalf of captive wildlife. Now, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so Leonard is crying, and it's just because I'm not going over to pet him right now. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does have jurisdiction to enforce this take provision on its own. We do see the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service enforce the Endangered Species Act in relation to wildlife trafficking on a regular basis. The only time that we've ever seen the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service enforce the take provision in relation to captive wildlife in Joe Exotic's case. And that happened only after he had already been charged with 2 counts of murder for hire in his plot to attempt to murder Carol Baskin. So we have a problem of chronic under-enforcement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service too. There's also the issue that it's just a small subset of animals who are protected. It's only threatened and endangered species who are actually protected. But thankfully, both tigers and lions are listed species. And so we've been able to use the Endangered Species Act to work to stop the cub petting industry. And the first case was the Dade City's Wild Things case. Is this a video? No. So we started with the Dade City's Wild Things case. The first thing that happened was an eyewitness investigation. That's something that PETA is pretty well known for. We don't often do that in relation to these litigation targets, but the eyewitness investigation came first. And what we found in the eyewitness investigation was extensive exploitation and abuse of big cats who are used for cub petting. So what you're seeing in this video still right here is a cub who's just been born being pulled through the mesh of a cage, taken from her mother so that she can become acclimated to humans and be used for cub petting and to line the pockets of Dade City's Wild Things as quickly as possible. So after seeing all of this evidence, PETA decided to file an Endangered Species Act lawsuit against Dade City's Wild Things, alleging that the practice of prematurely separating tigers from their mothers, using them in photo ops and swim encounters, Dade City's Wild Things, in addition to photo ops, you could also pay $200 to jump into a pool and have a tiger cub thrown into the pool with you. The cubs typically were frantically trying to get out. They were pulled back into the pool by their tails. So we alleged that using them in those photo ops and the swim encounters violated the ESA, as did confining them in the type of inadequate conditions that you see here. Over the years, Dade City's Wild Things had acquired several cubs from Joe Exotic, including Luna, who is prominently featured in the Dade City's Wild Things investigation, and you can see more about that at PETA.org. And Luna was only 1 week old when Dade City's Wild Things took her from Oklahoma to Florida after they acquired her from Joe Exotic. So these suits, there's never a dull moment, and we ended up winning this case on a default judgment because, as all of you attorneys know, part of the civil discovery process can include what's called a site inspection. And so PETA requested a site inspection of Dade City's Wild Things property as part of our case. Well, Dade City's Wild Things didn't want PETA on their property. And so they hatched a scheme to move all of their tigers off the property because they thought, no tigers, no site inspection. So social media has been such a blessing for those of us who advocate for captive wildlife, because a lot of the people who operate these facilities are narcissists and they share everything. So Joe Exotic was still operating then, and we saw on his Facebook page a fundraiser. He was raising funds because he said that he was going to be taking 19 tigers from a facility that PETA was forcing to close in Florida. And there were not a lot of facilities in Florida that would have had 19 tigers at the time, and certainly none that PETA was working to close as vigorously as Dade City's Wild Things. So it became very clear immediately that they were talking about Dade City's Wild Things cats. And so we immediately went to the court and requested a temporary restraining order, asking the court to bar Dade City's Wild Things from moving the tigers off the property. The court agreed with us and entered the TRO. Well, Dade City's Wild Things moved them anyway. They transferred 19 tigers in a metal, come here, sweet boy, in a metal cattle trailer. This was in the heat of summer. And one of the tigers was pregnant, and she gave birth along the way to 3 cubs, all of whom died. When the cats arrived at Joe Exotic's facility, he live streamed the event on Facebook. There were no water receptacles available for the cats along the way. And when they pulled out one of the juvenile cats, I think the clip was something like 3 minutes long, and the cat was drinking from a mud puddle the entire time. That's how thirsty they were. So after that happened, we did eventually get our site inspection, despite the fact that there were no cats there. But Dade City's Wild Things also thought, well, no tigers, no lawsuit. But we instead went to the court and said, Judge, because Dade City's Wild Things transferred these tigers to other facilities, these tigers are evidence in the case. And because they've been transferred, now these tigers constitute spoliated evidence, because we won't be able to tell if this tiger has X, Y, or Z physical or psychological injury. We won't be able to trace that injury to Dade City's Wild Things or potentially this other facility. There's no way for us to prove our case. And because of that and some other misconduct that the defendants engaged in this case, the court granted us a default judgment and a permanent injunction against Dade City's Wild Things, which is now permanently banned from owning or possessing endangered tigers or allowing anyone else to keep them on its property as a result of that case. One of the other great things about the ESA is that it has a fees provision where the prevailing party can seek its attorney's fees and court costs following successful litigation. And so the court recently entered a judgment against Dade City's Wild Things, requiring that it pay PETA nearly $400,000 in attorney's fees and costs. And PETA ultimately rescued a total of 27 tigers from Dade City's Wild Things, and the facility closed for good following PETA's win. So the cat that you see at the top left-hand side of your screen, that's Luna, being used in a cub petting photo op encounter. And then that's her after her rescue on the right. And then on the bottom left, that's both Luna is on the right, and then closest to the screen is a cat named Remington. And then that's him also on the right. And Dade City's Wild Things fought really, really hard to keep these two tigers because they desperately wanted to breed these two white tigers because they're even more lucrative for photo ops. But thankfully we were able to rescue them, and they now live at the Turpentine Creek Wildlife Refuge in Arkansas. So the next case that we brought was against another Tiger King star, Tim Stark, who operated a roadside zoo in Indiana called Wildlife in Need. So that gives you an idea of how cub petting took place at Wildlife in Need. And so in this second suit challenging cub petting, we decided to expand what we were going for. And so instead of just suing on behalf of tigers, we sued on behalf of tigers, lions, and tiger-lion hybrids, arguing that even those hybrids were covered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. And that was critically important because Jeff Lowe and some of these other major players in the industry, and Jeff Lowe is a breeder and someone who transferred cubs to others in the industry, they were starting to say that to insulate themselves against PETA Endangered Species Act lawsuits, they were going to start breeding and using exclusively hybrid cats, thinking that that would prevent them from being sued. But what the Endangered Species Act, the law under the Endangered Species Act actually says is that hybrids of listed species are also protected. So lion tiger hybrids are protected under generally under case law, but it had never been explicitly enumerated in one of these cases that tiger lion hybrids specifically were covered. And so this was something that was really, really important for us to establish under the law. So in this case, PETA alleged that Stark's practices of, again, prematurely separating big cat cubs from their mothers and using them in encounters violated the Endangered Species Act. But we also alleged that Stark's practice of declawing big cat cubs also violated the ESA's wounding provision, as well as the harm and harassment provisions. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all this, but declawing is not like just trimming our nails or even pulling our nails off. It's an amputation, and you could liken it to amputating our fingers at the first knuckle. It's extremely debilitating to cats, and as we have seen, it causes lameness and a lifetime of psychological and physical suffering. So we, right out of the gate, this time, again, we were trying to move the law forward. And so we immediately sought a preliminary injunction asking the court to prevent Stark from prematurely separating big cat cubs from their mothers and using them in public encounters during the pendency of the case. We argued that the injuries to the cats and to PETA's case was so great that this remedy was necessary. And we also argued, we initially argued for a TRO against declawing, that was granted. And then we went for the preliminary injunction, and that was granted too. And so that was the first ever preliminary injunction preventing all of these activities that are necessary for big cat cub petting. And because Stark repeatedly violated the preliminary injunction, he was, just like in the Dade Cities Wild Things case, getting into some trouble with the judge right off the bat. And then he transported lion cubs to Jeff Lowe at Jeff Lowe's roadside zoo in Oklahoma. And that resulted in Lowe being added as a defendant in this case. PETA won the suit against Stark on summary judgment, essentially meaning that the evidence in PETA's favor was so overwhelming that a trial wasn't needed. The claims against Lowe in that case haven't been resolved yet, but we expect that soon. So the ruling against Tim Stark became the first ever legal precedent providing that prematurely separating lions, tigers, and lion-tiger hybrids from their mothers and using them without medical necessity and using them in photo ops violates the federal ESA. So it was a landmark groundbreaking decision that we are so excited about, and it's what we've been working toward. And then in September of 2020, PETA confiscated 22 big cats from Wildlife in Need, as well as the 3 juvenile lions that Stark had transferred to Lowe from the Greater Wynnewood Zoological Park. One of those was Nala, the cub that you saw in that clip at the beginning of the presentation. And thanks to expert veterinary care from the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado State University, Nala has healed and is able to play with her fellow lions again. So that's her, she's with her little pride on the left, and then that's her on the right, rambunctiously playing with one of her lion friends. After PETA's suit was filed, the Indiana Attorney General's office filed suit against Stark and Wildlife in Need, alleging violation of state nonprofit laws, including alleging that Stark was using Wildlife in Need's funds to pay for personal expenses. And the state won a preliminary injunction to remove all animals other than the big cats from the property. And that occurred just before our rescue of the big cats. So when we left the property, all of the cages at Wildlife in Need were finally empty. And since the preliminary injunction, the Indiana Attorney General's office won their case. So those animals are permanently removed from Tim Stark's facility, and he has also been permanently banned from ever again owning exotic animals or any animal that is native to Indiana. So it's a tremendous victory for the animals. And that brings us to Jeff Lowe. Here's a video. This was taken last summer at Jeff Lowe's Greater Wynnewood Exotic Animal Park, which is the zoo that he took over from Joe Exotic. And what you're seeing here is a condition called fly strike. So it usually happens at facilities that have terrible sanitation. I'm going to show it just one more time. And so what happens is flies will land on animals' body parts. They'll lay eggs, and then the maggots will hatch and eat away at the animal's skin. And as you can see, this is actually Nala. As you can see, part of her ear is gone. We don't know if the ear is gone from some type of trauma or if it was eaten away by maggots, but she clearly had significant trauma as a result of this fly strike. So PETA has filed an Endangered Species Act lawsuit against, excuse me, Jeff Lowe, several of his associates and affiliated businesses, alleging that prematurely separating big cat cubs and baby lemurs from their mothers, using them in public encounters, housing them in inadequate conditions, and providing them with inadequate care violates the ESA. So again, we're trying to move the law forward. We're including lemurs in our case this time because lemurs are also ESA protected, and the Lowe's used them for public encounters. Prior to even filing our suit, PETA was able to convince the court to allow pre-suit depositions and a site inspection at the Lowe's new Thackerville, Oklahoma property. We argued that we needed this pre-suit discovery in order to determine which animals and how many animals were at the facility because of the Lowe's history of deception with federal agencies and law enforcement. So in this case, PETA is asking the court to enter a permanent injunction prohibiting all of the defendants from owning all ESA protected animals in the future, and ordering the animals to be surrendered to reputable facilities where they can get the care that they need. And again, on the subject of moving the law forward, come here, Bubba. We're also in this case alleging that the mere practice of breeding tiger lion hybrids in the first place violates the Endangered Species Act because of all of the physical, social, and psychological issues that are that plague these animals as they grow. And that's something that we're able to substantiate through our sanctuary partners and our wonderful experts. And it's not just PETA now that's using our legal precedents. The Department of Justice in November 2020 filed suit against Jeff Lowe, his wife Lauren, and two of their affiliated businesses. And among the allegations in their case are claims that prematurely separating big cat cubs, including hybrids, from their mothers, same with lemurs, violates the ESA, as does using them in public encounters. And the DOJ borrowed almost verbatim the analysis from PETA's complaint and briefing in the Wildlife and Meat and Tim Stark case, as well as citing to the precedent in our lawsuit. And so this was a huge victory for us because we have been pushing federal authorities for years and years to enforce the Animal Welfare Act and the Endangered Species Act against these big cat abusers, and to interpret the ESA and the AWA to prohibit these activities. And what I have in my outline is that a preliminary injunction in the case resulted in the confiscation of every cub from Lowe's new facility in Thackerville. But the breaking news is actually, as of yesterday, every single ESA protected big cat has been confiscated from Jeff Lowe as a result of this DOJ suit. 70 cats total were confiscated over just the past 2 days. So there are no tigers left at Tiger King Park. So really hats off to the Department of Justice. They're doing an incredible job with this case. So early last year, Ingrid Newkirk, the president of PETA, was asking about where we were with eradicating the cub petting industry. And I put together a plan thinking that we could eradicate this industry in 10 years. Fast forward a few months, given all of the progress that we've made in 2020 and 2021, and we're already almost there. We've taken out the big players. The breeders are not there anymore. The supply of cubs isn't there anymore. And because PETA and now the Department of Justice has been so aggressively enforcing the Endangered Species Act, facilities are worried about engaging in this activity because they don't want to be next. So cub petting in Michigan. Michigan has a roadside zoo problem. We have at least 10 roadside zoos that I've been able to find. Some of them are among the worst of the worst in the country. DeYoung Family Zoo in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan has offered various types of cub petting in the past. There's an exhibitor in the Detroit suburbs called Premier Animal Attractions that offers cub petting at private events. But most notoriously, Oswald Bear Ranch in the Upper Peninsula exploits baby bears every summer at cub petting encounters. Here's a video. One of the biggest misconceptions that Oswald gladly perpetuates is its claim that they rescue the cubs that it uses for cub petting each year. And that is a lie. It buys them from breeders who breed cubs for exactly this purpose. And we have the receipts to prove it. PETA does extensive public records requests, and we have documentation revealing that 80 of the 105 bears taken in by Oswald's since 1992 were captive bred for use in photo ops. The roadside zoo has been cited for physically abusing a cub, allowing a cub to bite a guest, and endangering children by allowing them to hand feed cubs. Cubs at the facility have been documented pacing and crying out and biting cages in distress, and they've also suffered from hair loss, likely from chronic exposure to the unyielding concrete that they're forced to live on as cubs, which can also seriously hinder their physical development. This little baby right here is one of the cubs that Oswald's will be using for photo ops starting next weekend. They're reportedly going to have 3 cubs this year as they typically do, and this baby was taken to a public event already just a couple of months ago. So these are some of the certificates of veterinary inspection proving that Oswald's Bear Ranch acquired these cubs from known breeders. The breeder in this case is a man named Bob Sawmiller. He operates in both Ohio and Indiana, and the conditions at his facilities are so poor that all of his bears were actually just confiscated by the USDA earlier this year, which, as I mentioned earlier, is something that almost never happens. And by way of example, it's the first confiscation that the USDA has done in, I think, 5 years. So that's how bad things were at Bob Sawmiller's place. Here are a couple of other certificates of veterinary inspection. These are some of the USDA Animal Welfare Act citations that Oswald's Bear Ranch has received over the years. And the Michigan OSHA concluded that that Oswald's employees are placed at risk of death or serious injury because the roadside zoo allows direct contact between adult bears and staff. In 2013, Oswald's misled lawmakers to believe that it regularly received cubs from the Michigan DNR, but the agency actually hadn't placed cubs at the facility since 2005 as a matter of policy. And so if you go to PETA.org and look up Oswald's Bear Ranch, you'll see some of the data that we've been able to compile about the reality for animals, for bears at Oswald's Bear Ranch. And unfortunately, one of the big obstacles for advocates is that Dean Oswald is extremely politically well connected. He has been able to get multiple laws benefiting his business specifically passed by the Michigan legislature. even just a few years ago, bear cub petting was illegal in Michigan. But Dean Oswald was able to get then Governor Rick Snyder and as well as members of Michigan's Congress to pass a law specifically allowing him to engage in cub petting. It isn't drafted, to specifically mention Oswald, but he's the only one engaging in this business in Michigan. And in addition to that, when we first started fighting against this cruelty a few years ago, we were able to get stories in the media pointing out the hypocrisy and all of the information that we were able to find contradicting Dean Oswald's claims. But his supporters are so rabid and his support is so widespread in Michigan that at this point there's a virtual press lockout. We can't get stories placed about Oswald's bear ranch, no matter how damning the evidence we provide to the media. So how can we end cub petting in Michigan? It's not going to be easy. The first step is getting the Big Cat Public Safety Act passed at the federal level. We all need to urge our federal legislators in both houses to support and pass the Big Cat Public Safety Act. At this point, neither of Michigan's senators is supporting the bill as a co-sponsor. What this bill would do, obviously it only applies to big cats, it would not apply to bears, but it would prohibit the private ownership of big cats, and it would also ban cub petting. It would prohibit direct contact between members of the public and big cats. So that would be a huge step in the right direction for animals and for Michigan, because if we can get this law passed at the federal level, it makes it so much easier for us to argue to the USDA that all other forms of cub petting should also be illegal. And it also supports our asks when we go to the Michigan legislature and ask that they ban all forms of cub petting in Michigan. And never be silent. We need to make it uncool for people to post images of themselves posing with any type of wildlife. It's something that I think in the wake of Tiger King, we're starting to see become a bit more taboo. But anytime you see someone posing with captive wildlife on social media, speak up. And you don't need to be rude or snarky about it. You can just present them with the facts. And if you're not sure what to say, you can go to PETA.org and there's a ton of information that you can use. But people need to know that they're going to be called out, just like it has been with people wearing fur. We need to make cub petting just as taboo. We also need to speak out when we see fluff pieces. This is a fluff piece about Oswald's Bear Ranch that was posted in a Michigan outlet last year. Write letters to the editor, write to the outlet saying you want fair and balanced coverage. And finally, we need to work toward banning all cub petting in Michigan, and that starts with the Big Cat Public Safety Act. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
Okay, it looks like we've got one in the chat. Has PETA been able to determine why Oswald has such political clout in Michigan? The changes regarding bear cub petting that have eroded the protections of the Large Carnivore Act don't mention Oswald's, but as you said, they may as well.
No, we don't know why. We've been able to track Oswald's personal political contributions, and they're not big. I mean, the only thing that I can think is because of where he is in the Upper Peninsula, and because so many people in Michigan are in the Upper Peninsula so often. I mean, kind of everybody knows him. But no, we really don't know why lawmakers are bending over backwards for this guy. It's a big problem.
I will say Attorneys for Animals opposed the bills you referred to that weakened the Large Carnivore Act and testified against it. And he was there in person. This was pre-COVID. And he's super folksy.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think when people live in the UP, there is so lightly populated, there's only one senator for the entire UP, and they have outsized influence. And in this legislature, in this political climate, other legislators who don't particularly care will just go along with the UP elected officials.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I mean, and, you know, talking about how fanatical these supporters are, we did a mobile billboard up by Oswald's a couple years ago. I think it was over Labor Day weekend. And the poor guy who was driving the thing, he was followed, his car was keyed, and he was actually run off the road.
Let's see.
Any other questions?
Let's see, there might be. People are thanking you. Let me ask you probably a final question, and this may still be up in the air, but do you think when everything's out, finally done, do you think Tiger King will prove to have been a positive toward ending this? Because it just seems so. Last year at the beginning of the pandemic, you couldn't do anything without seeing all this hoopla about Tiger King.
Yeah, Tiger King, for all its flaws, it has been instrumental in pushing this work forward. This lawsuit, this Department of Justice lawsuit against Jeff Lowe, it would not have happened if Tiger King wouldn't have happened, because what we saw was Jeff Lowe became famous, and he was famously flouting the USDA and the law with just horrific abuse of animals. And it was abuse that both the USDA and the Fish and Wildlife Service had turned their backs on for years with Joe Exotic and so many other facilities. But because it was making national news headlines, they had to act, and they have been extremely aggressive and done a great job with the lawsuit.
One other question. Do you see a role of state attorneys general getting involved as they did in Indiana? Because I don't think that was a particularly liberal or animal friendly office, and any suggestions on how to work with them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And there have been several instances actually where we've seen state attorneys general step in these cases in different ways. PETA actually went to the Attorney General in Michigan a couple years ago because Oswald's, at the time, it was a for-profit corporation, and it was soliciting donations for this bear cub club. And so, you know, we went to Dana Nessel and said, hey, you know, they can't legally solicit donations in Michigan. And so they didn't take any punitive action against Oswald's, but they did require them to come into compliance and to take down their solicitations in the meantime. Obviously, there was the Indiana AG intervention. Again, I think that's something that really came about and was pursued aggressively because of Tiger King. And then in Virginia, it's the only, I think it's still the only state with an animal focused section in its AG's office, and it's run by an attorney named Michelle Welch. And she shut down a roadside zoo called Wilson's Wild Animal Park that PETA had been fighting against for years. All of the animals were confiscated, and through that confiscation, she was able to find evidence that this facility was engaging in trafficking of endangered lions with Doc Antle in South Carolina. And so this incredible attorney decided to go after Doc Antle as well, both for trafficking, ESA trafficking under the Virginia ESA, as well as cruelty to animals in Virginia. So, so Doc Antle is now facing a state indictment because of a bold Attorney General's office.
Well, I want to thank you, and I hope you look in the chat. People are saying fantastic work and great presentation.
Oh,
thank you. Thank you for sharing the information, and good luck with the house hunting.
I am going to need it.
And Anne is welcoming you back to Michigan, hoping you can find a house soon. So
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. And if anybody has any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me. You can, B has permission to share my email address if you have any thoughts about Oswald's or any questions or anything else. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
thanks, Brittany. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.